Tonight is part two of the fiery furnace. You might recall last time we were leading up to a complete story, but we left off at the preparatory part where Daniel's three friends had just gotten accused. So let's look at our story outline. Like any good story, this starts with a setup and then a challenge, and that's where we left off last time. Now, what we're going to do is complete that challenge, and then we're going to have a response, and then we're going to see what the consequences are. Then finally, we have the outcome of the whole story. So let's review from last time. Last time we covered the first 12 verses of Daniel 3. So King Nebuchadnezzar, for whatever reason in his head, decided to make an image of gold, 60 cubits, which is 90 feet tall, and 6 cubits, which is 9 feet wide. We're not sure what this was, whether it was something symbolic or actually an image of himself or one of his gods, but we know that he made this and he put it on the plain of Dura, wherever that might be, but wherever it ended up, it was within plain view of just about everybody. He then issued a command, which was delivered by a very loudly speaking herald, to fall down and worship this golden image whenever they were cued by a lot of music. 7 or 8 different instruments was mentioned. And anybody not found worshiping the image was to be cast into a fiery furnace. All right, we suspect that this was a religious act he was instituting to bring unity to all the various groups that he had conquered. Remember, it wasn't just Babylon, but it was Babylon plus all of the subdued kingdoms, including Judea, that he was now in charge of. He was basically in charge of the known world, which was centered in the Middle East, which is in today's Iraq. The music was probably chosen because it stirs up emotions. So not only would it be something that people would notice, but it would also stir them to an idea of worship, which is what he was trying to get everybody in the mind for. And everybody participated in this. We read that all the nations, all the peoples would bow down to this thing, except for 3 guys. Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember, that was their Babylon names. I don't remember their Hebrew names off the bat. We can look it up later if you want to know. The people who were bowing down to the statue, they were fearing the king of Babylon. But these 3 men feared the King of Kings, God himself. Now, Daniel's 3 friends didn't make a protest. They didn't loudly complain. All they did was just refuse to bow down. So they weren't causing some sort of riot. They weren't making a big ruckus. And yet, the Chaldeans, remember that's the wise men who were sort of jealous for the attention that Daniel and his 3 friends were getting. The 3 friends were accused of being disloyal to the king. That's bad news when your king is Nebuchadnezzar. Chaldeans were undoubtedly acting out of jealousy, as I mentioned, and generally hatred for the Jews. And that's not just them, but Satan behind the scenes is always trying to defeat God's plan. And when it involves the Jews, you see in history that Satan is behind the scenes. So the Chaldeans reported it to the king, and that's where we get into our situation. Speaking of situation, let's talk a little bit about situational ethics. This is a politically correct term that you may have run across very recently, like in the last decade or two. This is talking about when it's right or wrong to do something. Now, situational ethics is defined by Merriam-Webster as taking into account the particular context of an act when evaluating it ethically, rather than judging it according to absolute moral standards. Well, you folks know that we're all for absolute moral standards because we obey God, and God is the standards bearer. So with the intent to have a fair basis for judgments or action, one looks, if they're following situational ethics, to the personal ideals of what is appropriate to guide them rather than an unchanging universal code of conduct. And guess what? Our 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were right in the middle of it. What if Daniel's 3 friends chose to act under situational ethics? What could have happened at that point? They could have rationalized themselves. They could have bowed down to the image, thinking to themselves, we're bowing down to the idol physically, but remaining standing in our hearts. Or they could have thought, well, we owe it to the king for his being so kind to us, so let's bow down anyway, because it really doesn't mean anything to us. They could have thought, well, we're more useful to God alive than dead. He needs us to remain in our position so we can help others. Or they could have thought, well, nobody in Jerusalem's going to know whether we bow down or not, so we may as well just go with the flow, right? Well, all those things are jeopardizing their position with God, and they recognize that. So instead, they decided to obey God. They put God first, no matter what. That's my key phrase for this lesson, no matter what. As a result, their obedience became obvious. As we were talking about last time, anytime man's laws divert away from God's laws, it becomes more and more obvious when you are obedient to God. And here it was very obvious. They were the only ones standing when everybody else around was bowing down to this image. But the neat thing is, because they stuck to their guns, God ended up using them in a way that was far more effective than anything else they could have ever imagined. So we'll see how that story unfolds. Warren Wiersbe, which, by the way, I'm now the proud owner of about 6 different Wiersbe books I ordered on Amazon. Someday I'll find time to read them. Yeah, here's a quote from Warren Wiersbe in his Bible Exposition Commentary. The difference between the true believer and the unbeliever is in the presence of faith, because everybody lives by faith in something. The difference is in the object of that faith. The crowd believed the herald and the king, and therefore they obeyed the king. The three Hebrew men believed the commandment of God, and so they disobeyed the commandment of men. The crowd had credulous faith, but the Jews had confident faith. And that's what we're looking for, not credulous faith that everybody can believe in, but confident faith in God. Okay, so now we're up to the second half of the challenge. Remember, the first half was when they got accused of being disloyal to the king. Now let's see how that pans out. In verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. So already we see some interesting clues about Nebuchadnezzar. He interpreted their disobedience as an act of treason, not just a religious offense. Remember, he set this statue up for nationality's sake, not for religious sake. So to him, it was really important to get everybody under the same umbrella, so to speak. Not to mention the fact that he had an anger management problem. I think everybody can see that. And that unfolds even more as we go into our story. Proverbs 16:32 shows this is not the right way to behave. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit better than he who captures a city. And if that describes anybody, it describes Nebuchadnezzar, who captured cities all around and became the de facto leader of the known world. So verses 14 and 15. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said unto them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the harp and the pipe and the lyre and the trigon, all those things, to fall down and worship the image that I've made, all well and good. But if you don't, you shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who's going to deliver you out of my hands? Well, I'll say one thing for Nebuchadnezzar. At least he didn't accept the accusation at face value. The Chaldeans came up and said that these boys are being disloyal to him. Maybe he was being distrustful after a couple of decades with these Chaldeans in his court. Maybe he didn't quite trust them anyway, which is how he got to the dream sequence that we found in chapter 2. He had a lot invested in these guys. Remember, these are the Jewish men that he devoted 3 years of schooling to, or brainwashing, depending on how you look at it. So maybe he wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be thrown away. He wanted to make sure they didn't accidentally not hear or understand, so he made sure the point was brought across. We can see Nebuchadnezzar's ego in how he phrased everything. He said, my gods, or the image I have set up. We can also see that he's a secularist. He's a humanist. What's he making this statue for but for national purposes? He's clearly placing himself above the very God of gods and Lord of kings, which he himself had confessed just 2 decades previously after Daniel revealed the dream to him. So, what's the response? That's our next setup in our story. 16 to 18, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. We have no need to answer you is kind of a funny phrase in the ESV, so I went to other translations. In the King James, it says, we are not careful to answer you in this matter. In the New Living Translation and the NIV, they both say, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. In NASB, I think it's maybe even clearer. We don't need to give you an answer concerning this matter. What they're really trying to say is, we don't need time to come up with a response to you. We already know what our answer is going to be. So it wasn't the fact that they were trying to be disloyal or that they were trying to be disrespectful. They actually were very respectful in the way they responded. O king, this is how we believe. O king, this is what will happen. They weren't representing an arrogant or disrespectful response. Instead, they were admitting that the charge was true. So they weren't contesting it at all. And remember the phrase, he is able, if he decides, to rescue us. They were affirming their faith and trust in God's ability to deliver them. And keep in mind, this is kind of similar to when Daniel offered to tell the king his dream. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar was ready to wipe out all the wise men, and Daniel said, wait a minute, we can give you the answer to the king, to the dream. Now, there's a little bit of a difference between Daniel's response to the king for the dream sequence and for Daniel's three friends here. And Daniel's three friends, they weren't sure what was going to happen next. So they said, we won't bow down. God can deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we won't bow down. In Daniel's case, he knew that everybody was going to be killed anyway if he didn't do anything. So he went ahead and promised, because if he hadn't promised, they would have been put to death anyhow. But if not, remember the three friends were saying, but if God doesn't rescue us, they were ready to burn rather than betray. How's that for an alliteration? Burn rather than betray God, because they'd already yielded their hearts to him. So surrendering their physical bodies to him wasn't an obstacle anymore. They had already yielded their hearts, their body would follow. That's a great attitude. So what was their reasoning behind this response? Well, it was very clear in these three men's minds that God had the power to save them. What was not clear was how God would work out his plan for their situation. But whether they would be rescued or not, they refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's image. So they stuck to their grounds, they stuck to their beliefs. And keep in mind that idols are a snare or a trap. We know this from all of the Old Testament and all of the warnings that God gave to Israel in the book of Judges and in 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're an abomination of God, and they are a trap because you can be lured into practices without realizing. The first commandment says there can be no other gods. The second commandment very clearly prohibits all forms of image making. Nothing should come between you and God, not even a representative, a physical representative. Simply put, these young men knew their scripture, and they knew the command of God, and that's why they wouldn't bow down to this image, no matter what. So, what are the consequences? What happened? Verses 19 to 23, Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You can just see that fake smile, are you going to obey or not, fade away as he just was filled with rage. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, hope you got that point, that's 3 guys, fell down into the burning fiery furnace. What is Nebuchadnezzar doing here? He's acting on emotion. Now, I don't know how many good bosses and bad bosses you may have had in your careers, but whether they're good or bad, I've often noticed that bosses act with a lot of emotion. That's why they get things done. That's why they've become the boss, because they know where to push the buttons. And a lack of humility and emotion-driven response is often great for becoming a good boss or even a world dictator. But rational thought is actually stronger and better in the long term. As Proverbs 29 says, a man of wrath stirs up strife, and one who is given to anger causes much transgression. So thinking rationally and clearly is the better way to go. What was this furnace? Was it just specially built for this particular purpose to torture people? Well, we don't know what the furnace was because we've never actually found it. We found a lot of things in Babylon because there's been a lot of archaeology going on for decades there. But it was probably not built specifically for execution. Why do we know that? Because it was said that it was heated 7 times hotter than usual. Than usual implies that it had a usual operating temperature and therefore a usual purpose. Perhaps it was an industrial furnace. It wouldn't be a heating furnace for heating a residence, like it wasn't part of the castle or anything, because that sort of technology didn't come for another several centuries. So possible purposes of this furnace might be maybe an ore smelter. After all, the Babylonians knew about iron and ironworking. So if it was an iron smelting furnace, they could have heated that under normal circumstances up to about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the temperature at which iron melts. Or it could have been a brick kiln. Remember, Babylon had all these wonderful, beautiful glazed bricks that were part of the processional way and the tile that they had and everything. That was one of the shining things that made Babylon so pretty. And stone is kind of rare in the region, so bricks were the way to go for construction. And if it was a brick kiln, it would probably fire up at around 1,400 degrees, sometimes a little hotter depending on the kind of brick. But what does 7 times hotter mean? That doesn't always make a lot of sense. 7 times is most likely a figure of speech, meaning as hot as possible. How do we know this? Well, consider with the normal operating temperatures we just mentioned. 7 times hotter would melt the furnace itself and everything around it. For instance, 7 times 1,400, well, it's huge. So it would be over 9,000 degrees. Tungsten is the element with the highest melting point, about 6,100 degrees, 6,200 degrees. The surface of the sun, just short of 10,000 degrees. So 7 times hotter would have been almost as hot as the surface of the sun, which wouldn't have been easy to approach. Also, when you're talking about temperature, times doesn't really work. What's twice the temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which is freezing? That would be what? 64 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a fairly decent outdoor temperature for winter around here. But 30 degrees Fahrenheit is 0 degrees Celsius. What's twice 0? Well, it's still 0. So times hotter just is a phrase that's sort of a figure of speech. It's not an actual temperature. And they were tossed in, clothes and all. The Greek historian Herodotus said the Babylonian dress at that time was a linen tunic. Remember, a tunic is like an overshirt that goes down to your knees. It's like almost a dress, but really just for purposes of outer covering. It would go over your inner shirt and inner clothing. And then they had that out of linen. They had another one of wool, would probably be more decorative on the outside, and a white short cloak and a turban. I don't know about curly shoes. I think that was Persia. But that's basically what they were tossed in with. And they were probably bound with rope, although it didn't say what they were bound with. The soldiers who threw the 3 Jewish guys into the furnace lost their lives in the process. This is the cost of acting emotionally, the cost of fury. It's interesting to note, by the way, that while the earthly king couldn't protect his own soldiers, we'll see that the God of heaven was able to protect his warriors of faith. Pretty cool. So, what's the outcome? Verses 24 to 25, then Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They said to the king, "Sure, that's right, true, O king." He answered and said, But I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the midst of the fire, and they're not even hurt. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. The word astonished here comes from the original Aramaic. It means all sorts of things. It means being dumbfounded or bewildered to the point of being in fear. So his jaw was dropping is what was happening. And unbound, that's interesting. It points out that the fire didn't harm the men, didn't harm their clothes. We'll find out it didn't even touch their hair, but it made quick work of the rope. The rope was gone in an instant. They were unbound at that point. So who was this fourth person? Well, most conservative commentators will tell you this is most likely a Christophany, not just an angelic messenger. It wasn't just an angel. It was probably the pre-incarnate Christ. That's what Christophany means. We see several instances of Christophanies in the Old Testament. Just look for any phrase, the angel of the Lord, not an angel, but the angel of the Lord. That's usually an indication that this is a Christophany, the pre-incarnate Christ himself visiting. For instance, remember when Abraham had the visitors that came to check out Sodom before they destroyed Sodom? That most likely that was a Christophany because it was they were sent with him. They were all worshiping him. And like son of the gods, there was probably something very visibly different about this fourth person that made Nebuchadnezzar notice that. So, 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door, probably not as near as his soldiers, of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. So he came near to the door, obviously not as near as his soldiers. Come to think of it, the soldiers probably died because when you're lifting somebody to throw them into the fire, you're probably breathing heavy, and breathing heavy around superheated air is not good for you. That's probably what killed them. Note that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, although they disobeyed the king for being ordered to bow down to the image, they had no trouble obeying the king for this command. So it wasn't that they were naturally disobedient; it's that they were choosing what they could obey. They would not be disobedient to God. So here we come to the conclusion. So, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and there wasn't even smell of fire that had come upon them. Note this was more than just Nebuchadnezzar. We have witnesses for his entire staff. All of the officials also noticed that there was not a hair burned on these people. The fire had no effect on their bodies, only on the bindings. The rope was completely burned off. Is this what's meant by Hebrews 11:34, when we're listing all the people of faith that men of old were quenched, who had quenched the power of fire? This is probably a reference to Daniel's 3 friends. This was a complete deliverance because God accomplishes it. This is something we can take heart with. God that starts anything will finish it. He's started a work in us. We know he's going to finish it in us. That's encouraging. These 3 men were not delivered from the fire, but through it. So that's an important point we're going to get to. Verses 28 through 30. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Boy, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't do anything halfway, does he? The pagans are greatly impacted by this witnessing an undeniable miracle by the hand of Israel's God. We see some glimmer of repentance too in Nebuchadnezzar's response, but I'll tell you, we still have chapter 4 to go, and I'm looking forward to hearing that one. I like to call that one the guest chapter because Nebuchadnezzar himself actually wrote most of it. By his declaration, that's Nebuchadnezzar's, that there is no other God, Nebuchadnezzar answers his own question he posed. He said, What God is able to deliver you from my hand? Now we know. He even answered it himself. So, What kind of impact does this have on us? No matter what. That's our key phrase for this lesson. In our Christian walk, we can become comfortable in this world, and we can begin to forget that we're not of this world. Romans 12:2, one of my favorite verses. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. I'd love to get a t-shirt that says, don't conform, transform. Quoting Colossians 3:1-2, if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on the things that are above, not on things that are on the earth. We know that God's word, we know God's word and we obey God's word. When we do that, his spirit will fortify us. We can be as bold as a lion when we're obedient. Now, I searched Hilo to try to get some Hilo. I found many verses that I want to wrap up with this, but I picked these three. First, let me get to this first. Remember that anything can be an idol in your life. We know in the Old Testament they had to deal with idol worship, because that was a popular thing to do. In our monotheistic culture, we tend not to have things to bow down to, but we still have things that are idols. If you're more devoted to anything, if something has come between you and God, it is an idol. We need to continually do a heart check because of the corrupting, destructive effects of idolatry. Do you have hobbies that get in the way of study time? Do you have people in your life that you need to drop everything to do and take care of them? And in doing so, maybe you've neglected your prayer. Now, there's always time for wisdom, and sometimes you have to balance your time as best you can for the circumstances. But generally speaking, nothing should come between you and God. If it does, it's an idol. So, my three verses, of course, Daniel would be the first passage. The book of Daniel is a great source of encouragement because it reminds us that God cares for his people and honors them when they are true to him. And 1 Peter 4:12-13, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. All of the chapters of 1 Peter are excellent for this topic. So the long-term goal, folks, remember how it turns out. We've seen the end of the story, and we know we win. And I heard a loud voice coming from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall be any mourning or crying or pain any more, for the former things have passed away. This is where we're heading, folks. Don't lose track of the long-term goal, no matter what.